Question.
Yes.
What happens when you lock while attempting to block?
I feel like I should know this answer. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the As Yet Unnamed podcast. I'm Swaku, your host, and with me today is my co-host, John.
Hello.
So we're starting a new series looking at the new wave of pre-constructed decks, which means...
Yep, today we'll be taking a look at the Ravnos deck. Now, the description from the Black Chantry website says this is a deck about charm and misdirection. Your vampires use their powers of obfuscate and presence to distract and manipulate their foes, undermining their power. For protection, you rely on animal spies and guards, and yet more illusions to turn even the mightiest threat completely harmless.
It sounds a little strange to me, right? Because you're looking at obfuscate and presence, and it's like, oh, it's a stealthy deck. But then it also starts talking about being able to turn even the mightiest threats harmless, and that kind of feels like a combat deck. We'll see more as we go, I guess.
Yes, we'll see as we go.
The stats for the deck, it is, as usual, a 89 card deck. So 12 crit cards and 77 library cards. There are 12 vampires in this deck, 11 of which are unique, and the average capacity for that is 5. Of the 77 library cards, you get about 13% masters, 12% actions, 3% equipments, 1% allies, 5% retainers, about 20% action modifiers, a small bit of like the mixed kind of combo cards that are like combination of combat or modifier or combat reaction, something like Resistor's Grasp, for
It's followed
example.
by the night.
There we go. Like there was an actual card in the deck or something. And 10% combat and a whopping 30% or 31% actually of reaction cards.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually starting to look like this isn't a typical stealth bleed deck. You know, your typical stealth bleed decks would have a heavy action and modifier package.
Yep, looking at the clan disciplines of obfuscate presence, you would expect they could pull off a stealth bleed, like we already see in Ministry, but what's the point of having two of the same archetypes, right? So I'm glad to see them mix it up a bit with this clan.
Yeah, definitely much better than Ministry 2.0 or Set Ministry. Alright, a quick look at, wouldn't be quick, sorry, because this deck is chock full of new cards with new arts and some notable reprints. So first off, the crypt is completely new, as it would expect, because Ravnos have gone through a huge change, and they've lost their disciplines of chemistry and fortitude and have gained obfuscate and presence. And I think as we go through that, you'll see that that has significantly changed somewhat how the deck plays.
How the clan plays.
How the clan plays, yes. Given that this is the only deck for the clan, stand by my statement.
Yep.
So the first vampire is the one that is doubled up in the deck, 3 Lekar. It's an 8 capacity Ravnos with superior animalism, superior fortitude, superior obfuscate, superior presence. And if she's ready at the start of the discard phase, you get an extra discard phase action, and she gets +1 bleed. I don't think that's much to talk about here. +1 bleed is nice, extra discard phase action is nice. There's a lot you get in the 8 capacity. Plus, there's some crossover with the old Ravnos disciplines.
Yeah, overall solid.
The next spam is Luciano Cavalho. He's a 6 capacity Ravnos and up with inferior presence, superior animalism, and superior fortitude. And during your discard phase, you can move an animal retainer from a vampire you control to another vampire you control. So it's a bit of a Heidelberg Castle on a stick.
A little bit. Pretty nifty.
Yeah, I kind of like the ability, but I'm actually more intrigued by the art. Tell me, what do you see here?
To me, it just looks like a guy smoking with his cow.
Yeah, but it also looks like his face lost a huge triangular chunk or something. Or is that something that I'm not?
Are you just talking about his fingers being weird?
Is that his fingers? Ah, okay. Alright, that makes more sense now. Okay, I see it.
Yep.
Okay, but I can't unsee what looks like a huge triangular cleave in his face. Anyway, thank you for pointing that out. I would never have noticed. God, I don't know, man. Next up, we have Gathi and Iban, I want to say. Gathi is a 5 capacity Ravnos Anarch with inferior obfuscate, superior animalism, superior presence. And during an action that Gathi performs, you can reveal the top card of your library. If it's a master card, he burns 1 blood, otherwise, he gets +1 stealth. And the reason why I'm mentioning Fiban together with Gathi is because Fiban, a 5 capacity Ravnos Anarch, superior animalism, superior obfuscate, superior presence, and once each combat, Fiban can discard a card at random to strike dodge. They're both random cycling effects because you're either discarding and drawing blind, or you are flipping the top card of your library blind. And I guess
flipping the top card doesn't cycle it. You just put it back, right?
That's a saying, right? Reading the card explains the card or something. Okay, that's fair enough. So Gathi isn't actually as random as I thought. It's more Fiban than when I was looking at Fiban and misreading Gathi's ability. I was sort of wondering, do they actually make sense in a deck that runs a single Week of Nightmares? Because if you randomly discard it, does that screw over your whole game plan?
I guess it's not so much an issue if you play Gathi as written, because that's the only forced mechanism, right? You have, oh no, you also can, but I guess Fiban is also a choice. Like if you have Week of Nightmares in hand, you have to make that choice whether you risk pitching or taking whatever's coming at you to the face.
I guess it's fair. It's an informed choice as opposed to a blind choice at that point.
Yeah.
Next card, we have a 3 capacity Ravnos. I don't actually know how to pronounce this.
Bam.
Yeah, I mean Fam, but also I think it's Trong Chao Fam. 3 capacity and Ravnos with just superior animalism. It's an interesting, they're interesting inclusion in the deck, I feel, because in a deck that is essentially obfuscate and presence heavy, what do you think, what role do you think he fulfills in the deck? Does he just sit around and gear up, or is he the designated chump blocker?
Well, it's kind of weird because, he could be a chump blocker. He has the right disciplines to pull off Feral Hounds, play Cat's Guidance and Guard Dog, and he also gets Protection Racket just fine. So that much kind of works. And Voracious Vermin is a pretty good combat card for chump blockers, so we'll get to that.
That's a good point. Well, that's not the full crypt, but that's the crypt cards that we thought were interesting. If you find that any of the other crypt cards were interesting as well, feel free to mention it in the comments. I'm happy to blame John for missing out on anything interesting.
I'll take that.
And I think let's go on to the new library cards. So first and foremost, we have Break the Bonds. It is an action card that requires an Anarch and either Animalism, Obfuscate, Presence, or any combination thereof. So it says Bleed. If you play the Animalism, Bleed is with +1 Bleed. If you play with Obfuscate, if the Bleed is successful, you can lock a minion controlled by the target Methuselah. And Presence, if the Bleed is successful, you get to add 1 blood to a vampire in your uncontrolled region. I'm of the opinion that even without Animalism, it potentially is an undue influence and a bit. But do you think the missing 1 stealth is an issue here?
I do prefer the 1 stealth. The thing about Bleed is you have to also look at the other modifiers that you have. At +1 Bleed, you only get an additional +1 before you start tempting AIs or Archon investigations. So in the deck, we have a +2 Bleed modifier, which we'll look at later. and you get +1s from various other things. So you can get it from Club Illusion, Wicked Nightmares, Treasured Samaji, and I think the Star Vamp has a perma bleed as well. So I think there's a choice to be made whether you're getting like this +1 and another +1 elsewhere, or if you're playing modifiers, because this doesn't pair well with Visions of Gehenna, in my opinion.
I mean, I see where you're coming from, but I have a slightly different opinion, having been on the receiving end of Break the Bonds for a couple of weeks now.
Do tell.
So the obfuscate part of the card is actually a lot more annoying to be on the receiving end. Typically, for stealth lead decks, assuming people don't just I'm not going to block you because I believe you're going to stealth gem or whatever. If the bleed lands, it does what you want to do, but you don't get really additional value out of it on your second bleed, because they still have 1 minion up and potentially block your one last bleed for the oust, or reduce, or flick, basically just play your reaction cards and generally annoying to your game plan. Break the Bonds allows you to, on a successful bleed, essentially pave the way for the second bleed. I guess from my point of view is you could choose not to play at Animalism and then still get away with being able to play the bleed modifier that we will talk about later on. That is an option.
It is an option.
I think if you really wanted to, there is a argument you can put forth to have a mix of Break the Bond and Undue Influence. So you could say use Break the Bond to lock down a minion that's would have been blocking otherwise, and then using Undue Influence means that there is more effort required to now block your one stealth action.
Yeah. And you also get the option of like using Break the Bonds with whoever you has like permanent bleed on it, like the Treasured Samaji, or what's her name? 3? Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, those can play Break the Bonds, and then the others with Superior Presence can play Undue Influence plus Gehenna.
Right.
Visions of Gehenna.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really wish it on you, but I do recommend being on the receiving end of Break the Bonds for a bit. You might change your opinion on how effective the card is.
Yeah, I'll have to see if it happens.
Next card, Feral Hound. It is a retainer card. Requires Ravnos and Animalism. It's an animal with 1 life. At inferior, if the action to employ this retainer is successful, unlock the vampire during your next discard phase. During the next discard phase. You can lock this retainer to give the employer +1 intercept. At superior, it says above, but unlock this vampire immediately after resolution of this action instead of the discard phase. I personally think it's a bit unfortunate that this is clan specific. I get it from a design point of balance point of view, mainly because you don't want to accidentally create unexpected, word for it?
Power creep.
Unexpected outbreak. No, not outbreak.
No, power creep.
Oh, power creep. Sorry, I was looking at Feral Hound and you said outbreak, and I was like, spay and neuter, man, spay and neuter. But not so much power creep, but more unexpected interactions with cards like Enkidu, who unlock at the end of the turn if you successfully employ an animal retainer or any retainer. So from a balance point of view, to play it safe, I get it. But my point was, if this was opened up to other clans, you have made an interesting deck building decision. Raven Spy and Feral Hound.
Yeah, I could totally see jank you could pull off with like the Jenny, Mother of Horrors, and maybe clan impersonation.
But all good decks.
It was not to be. I think it's a nice option to give the clan now that they don't have fortitude. They can still, grab a retainer, intercept retainer without losing an action, essentially. 0 blood cost is definitely good, and the gold standard is Raven Spy at 1 blood cost. Yeah, a free retainer's certainly not bad, and maybe not for dedicated walls since you only get the single use per round, but it's definitely there to prevent when you need it, and sometimes just being on the table is enough to deter any cheeky, sneaky things.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we were talking about earlier on before the broadcast is Pack Alpha, and all we were ready to just say this is a completely pointless card again in another deck.
Mm-hmm.
But we did come to a conclusion that there is a legitimate use for feeding the Feral Hound to Superior Pack Alpha.
Yeah, well, when you mentioned it, I totally didn't realize Pack Alpha had a superior option, because, eating a Raven Spy or a Raptor or a Dog Pack, not ideal. But Feral Hound, 0 blood cost, that's not a bad an option.
Yeah. And we'll come to that card later, but in combination with Week of Nightmares, a 2 strength becoming 3 strength Ravnos is a legitimate concern for blockers. You might be able to actually get an action through a bleed through without stealth.
Yep. So in with Feral Hound, Pack Alpha is not so much a get my retainers in without having to spend an action kind of card, but it's more of a, I got my Feral Hound, it didn't cost me an action, and now I can turn it into strength after, having spent it to block an action or something.
That's a good point. Pack Alpha doesn't care if the Feral Hound is locked or not. You can block and then get +1 strength.
Yep.
Alright, next card is the one that we've been talking about for a bit, Visions of Gehenna. It is an action modifier, requires Ravnos and Presence. And inferior, allies cannot block this action. And at superior, it's usable only during a bleed action. And I didn't notice this. Again, reading the card explains the card. It is as above with a +2 bleed. So it's not just a +2 bleed, it also still retains the allies cannot block this action.
Yeah, I also missed that bit as well. It's very easy to read that second bit and see, only usable bleed action, blah, 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 +2 bleed. But yeah, that blah, blah, blah happens to be as above, which is kind of a big deal. I like it. Getting +2 bleed in presence without a blood cost, kind of a big deal. I can't think of any other card that does that.
No, the only other card that does it costs 1 blood, which is Arrow of Elation.
Yep, and even in their presence actions, it's all very blood costy.
And it's a point that you've made on the notes is that it's easily cyclable, and I know you disagree with me on Force of Personality a lot, but I can agree with you here. Anything that's a narrow scope that has a cyclable secondary effect that doesn't limit you to that scope is always good.
Well, the big thing this has going for it over Force of Personality is it doesn't cost them blood to cycle it.
True, but okay. Anyway, that's a different discussion for a different thing. If you at home think that Force of Personality is worth that 1 blood to cycle, let us know in the comments below.
You won't get any comments.
It'll just be a bunch of comments saying, what are you on about? John's definitely right. Next up, we have another Visions of Zapapasura. It is a 1 blood cost reaction that requires Obfuscate and Presence. At inferior Obfuscate and inferior Presence, it reduces a bleed against you by 3. Superior Obfuscate plus Superior Presence, block this vampire to reduce the bleed against you to 0. And then it's got a reminder text that says the acting minion can still increase the bleed amount.
Yeah, the interesting thing about this one is, aside from the discipline requirements, there's no clan or sect requirements. So non-anarchs can play it, non-Ravnos can play it.
Well, I definitely agree with you here, and I kind of feel like that was what the card was designed for, more than to fit into this Ravnos deck. So something like the Ballet or Demetra and Friends, the Obfuscated Presence, Bruja Princess. Basically any mixed of vampires that has Obfuscate and Presence but do not have easy access to lead redirection.
I think the inferior option is what will get most play here. It doesn't require you to block, and it's not often you get bleeds much more than 3. So certainly that's what you'll be seeing it played as. The superior with the additional lock costs, which you can't even wake and play this. You need to actually be unlocked, correct?
Yes, it is locked too, so it's a cost. So if you can't lock it, you can't play.
Yeah, that's a pretty steep cost for something that doesn't happen very often. That said, it does mean that the primary option you can play with only inferior obfuscate or inferior presence. So like you were saying in the Demetra example, most of that deck only has inferior obfuscate, but lucky for you, that's enough.
Yeah, and the cute thing about the way it works is because bleeds can be reduced to less than 0, sometimes reducing a bleed by 3 is actually more effective than reducing a bleed to 0. So for example, if someone bleeds you for 2, and if you reduce it by 0 and then they follow up with a +1 bleed, you still cop a bleed of 1, the bleed still becomes successful. But if in the same situation you reduce the bleed by 3 instead, then to make the bleed successful, they'll have to increase that bleed by 2. Definitely agree with you 100% here that the superior feels like a Hail Mary kind of move in response to someone else's Hail Mary, if that makes sense.
Question.
Yes.
What happens when you lock while attempting to block?
I feel like I should know this answer.
Sorry, cut this out.
No, it's okay. I can cut it out, but it's a good question. If you block while you're attempting to block, the block would fail because only unlocked minions can attempt to block.
Next card.
Yep, next card. This is a card that I surprisingly haven't seen in play, even though my playgroup has seen a fair bit of Ravnos action with the new Ravnos. It is Ferocious Vermin. It is a combat card that requires animalism. It's got the cutest little rats on the art. I mean, we can argue cute, but I think it's cute.
Yep.
And I stand by it. At inferior animalism, it's a strike dodge, which is great. And at superior animalism, it is as above with an additional ranged strike burn weapon. So we had a conversation a while back, and I think I also had the same conversation with Stu on a previous video, which is between this and Canine Hordes. Like, which would you run both? Would you run just all? Does it replace Canine Hordes, or is it a supplement to Canine Hordes?
I think they have different homes. Voracious Vermin, just by itself, you could run like 8 to 10 of them, and that's your entire combat solution, right? It's a solid defensive option. Doesn't cost blood. You get a dodge, and you live to fight another day. If they come at you with a gun, you get to take it away. But that's just gravy. So I think this is an interesting option for animalism, which has traditionally been very violent. But with this, I think they have a solid, I guess, evasive combat option that you can just run by itself and be happy with it. Canine Hordes, I think, is better as a weapons destroyer, but that's its only purpose, right? The strike at range for 1 hour or whatever it is might as well not be on the card. You're holding it in hand until you need it, essentially.
I mean, you could argue that it helps the card cycle when equipments are not a thing.
Sure.
It is worth noting that K9 Hot also says destroy equipment rather than destroy weapon. So while the ferocious vermin specifically only eats, guns, bats, swords, knuckles, K9 Hot can also destroy things like the ball convergence, which is relevant to a obfuscate presence deck, or phase motion
The
detector.
ever-present Heart of Nichitas.
Heart of Nichitas.
Or that, sure. Yeah.
Yes, of course. Phase motion detector comes to my mind before Heart of Nichitas. I like your commentary on this card. It is a Night Terrace. It is a reaction that requires Ravnos and Obfuscate and Presence. At inferior Obfuscate and Presence, it reduces acting minion's stealth to 0. And there's a reminder text that says the acting minion can still increase the stealth. And at superior Obfuscate and superior Presence, it says above, and this vampire can strike combat ends during the first round of the resulting combat if they block. And it costs 1 blood.
So this was a stick of the chemistry reactions options, right? They had a couple reduce stealth to 0s and then do something in combat or something like that. So it's nice to see the new Ravnos have a similar card in that vein. And I think this is better than whatever they had in chemistry, so nice.
Yeah, 2 ticks from me. Although, having said that, this is like the requirements to play this card is not simple, right? You need to be Ravnos, and then you need superior Obfuscate, and then you need superior Presence if you want to have the strike combat end.
How many of the crypt actually can play it at superior?
Let's have a look. 3 or 4 if you count Sri Lanka has 2, get 2 copies of it. But yeah, 3 vamps in the deck can play Night Terrors as superior.
That said, when you're blocking, right, you have the option whether you want to get dirty and tear them up or you just want to strike combat ends, right? So if your deck is intending to, actually put up a fight, you only need to play it at inferior, and that's fine.
Also, because like you mentioned before, that this is a throwback reference to a whole bunch of Ravnos chemistry reaction cards from legacy sets. It is worth noting that you can reduce the acting minion stealth to 0 even if you're not the one attempting to block, or for that matter, even if nobody's attempting. And you can also reduce a 0 stealth action to 0 stealth. Feel free to correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. English would insist that you can't reduce 0 to 0, but I believe the card game allows for it.
Now, something you did mention earlier to me about that secondary effect is it applies if you somehow block an action multiple times, right?
Yes. So we never had a specific ruling for Night Terrors, but there are cards that have this, you get something in the resulting combat. So like Spirit's Touch, for example, is the Auspex reaction card, and as superior it says you also get a maneuver in the resulting combat if they block. And the ruling was you get that effect. So in this case, the strike combat ends each time you successfully block. So for example, if you're being bled and you use Night Terrors, you successfully block, and the opposing minion plays Form of Mist, and you somehow manage to block it again with the same vampire, you get the strike combat end, the ability to strike combat ends on the first round of that second resulting combat, but only if you block again. So like if it was a new combat due to psych, you don't get the combat ends, strike combat ends again.
Or constricted statue, or
we're gonna be here all night listing cards. Next card is a functional reprint. It's a functional reprint for Rom Gypsy. It's called City Star Taxi. It's exactly the same as Rom Gypsy. It's an ally card. Requires Ravnos. and 3 pull. Get a mortal with 2 life, 0 strength, 0 bleed. This ally can strike 1 range damage. This ally gets 1 optional maneuver each combat, and this ally can lock to give a Ravnos +1 stealth.
Yeah, Rom Gypsy never saw that much play when it was legal, so I don't expect this one to be making the rounds. +1 perma stealth on the table seems like it would be good, and it's not unique, so you could have more of them than just the one, but 3 pull, pretty costly.
And an action as well.
And an action. And you don't have fortitude anymore, so
that's a problem.
That's an expensive action.
It is an expensive action. Next reprint, Archon Investigation. I just wanted to talk about this just so that people are aware that Archon Investigation is back in circulation. It was last printed in the First Keepers of Tradition set in 2018, and recently as a promo, and it's finally in a pre-constructed deck. Next up, I have a collection, I guess, of what I call general good stuff. I think John mentioned this during the review of the Bruja New Blood reconstructed deck as well. It's Club Illusion, Power Base, Los Angeles, and the Garibaldi Muti Museum.
When you see museum, it's mostly for the recursive option, right? You get to pull back something that requires Anarch, be it Reckless Agitation or Bait and Switch. Those are the more deadly things that you see coming back over and over again. Here in the deck, there aren't too many options to actually pull back, or rather options that you would pay 1 pull to pull back, which would be the options you have are Break the Bonds and Protection Racket. Hardly worth the pull to recur, in my opinion. The other thing that the card can do is Lock Before Range is determined to end combat between 2 Anarchs, and one of them has to be one that you control. If you step back and look at the whole deck, that second option becomes more aligned with the game plan. But I guess we can talk about that more in a bit.
Yep, we'll talk about that in more detail when we talk about the game plan of the deck. Next card up is Veil the Legions. This was last reprinted in the Malkavian First Blood, and the last notable reprint I've got on my list is the Week of Nightmares. I think I've asked the question earlier. With the Ravnos deck as it is now, do you really still need Week of Nightmares, a finisher? So for those at home who are not familiar with the card, Week of Nightmares is a master card that requires Ravnos. Only 1 Week of Nightmares can be played in the game. Put this card into play with 10 Nightmare counters. Ravnos get +1 bleed and +1 strength and do not hunt as normal. Any Ravnos can steal 1 blood from another Ravnos as a +1 stealth hunt action. And during each Methuselah's unlock phase, that Methuselah can move 1 Nightmare counter from this card to any Ravnos. If this card has no counters, each Ravnos burns 1 blood for each Nightmare counter on them, or is burnt. Then burn this card and all Nightmare counters.
Yeah, if you haven't won the game by the time Wicked Nightmares runs out, you're not winning the game.
So do you think, with the deck as it is now, Ravnos still needs this as a finish?
Well, needs is a strong word, right? I think you can certainly pull out a win without it, but it certainly doesn't hurt to have in the deck. I would more often run it than not. Actually, I don't think I would ever not run it, but I wouldn't necessarily be like, just hold on until I get my Week of Nightmares. No, it's a nice to have.
That's a good point. So it's like a threat that's always looming in the background, but you don't necessarily have to hang on, don't get ousted until you fish up your Week of Nightmares. And you also don't have to be in a situation where you have Week of Nightmares in your opening hands and you're essentially spending half the game 6 card hand.
Yeah.
Right, so those are the new cards, new art, and notable reprints that we've got on our list for the Ravnos pre-constructed deck. So let's have a look at the deck strategy of this precon.
Yeah. So, what do you think it does?
I think depending on how hard you squint at it, it could be either a stealth bleed or a bit of a toolbox. I wouldn't. I think you mentioned this before the podcast. Like, it's not really a plan right now that encourages you to go full on stealth bleed. If you decide to just lean heavily to animalism, not animalism, literally not animalism, obfuscate and presence, you just kind of end up feeling sad that you're not just running ministry.
Exactly. Yep. I think if you're trying to do a stealth bleed, you're not going to do it as well as Ministry does with Platinum Protocol and all their Protean goodies. It's not at that same level.
You don't get Form of Mist, is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have a comment here that says you think it would be worth pivoting into Undue Influence plus Visions of Gehenna if you were doing stealth bleed. Has that changed since we started this podcast?
Has that changed? If I had to run it as stealth bleed, that's how I'd run it. Undue Influence, Visions of Gehenna, and maybe just trim down the crypt into just presence vamps. Because that's all you need, right? You don't need all the other disciplines. Well, you might want some obfuscate.
You can get away with just pure presence because you can run power 1 for the extra stealth and the extra speed.
And that option might become more relevant once, if we ever get like a larger crypt selection, more presence options at younger capacity vampires, maybe a bunch of 4 caps with just presence and obfuscate or something.
I think now that you mentioned that the deck can just run purely on presence, it does remind me of an older archetype where you ran a bunch of corridor anti-tribute and then leveraged Undue Influence and Power of 1 for stealth, and then used Palo Grande for the extra bleed. So you could do something similar here. Week of Nightmares is once per game, but you also have still access to Pop Illusion for a slightly more expensive Palo Grande.
Yep.
Pretty interesting deck right there. So you can bring other presence friends in as well.
Yeah, it certainly does some Ministry vamps you could pull into that build.
The other thing I see when I'm looking at the deck, going back to your original question, is a toolboxy sort of deck. The funny thing is, funny to me at this point, is that even though I see it as a toolboxy deck, if you didn't mention anything at all, I would just draw a complete blank as to what this deck is to do as a toolbox.
Yeah, so like I was mentioned earlier when we were talking about the Garibaldi Muichi Museum, that's actually one of the number of permanent tools they kind of build up over the course of the game. They get all sorts of things like permanent intercept in the retainer, whatever it's called. Permanent stealth in Feral Hound. Permanent stealth in the Taxi or the Fortune Teller shop. Permableed in some of the vamps have +1 bleed, or you have the Treasured Samaji, Weaker Nightmares, Club Illusion. Then they also have permanent combat solutions, which is like, again, Treasured Samaji and the Museum. So they certainly get stronger as the game goes on, as they get more and more tools on the table. And then once Weaker Nightmares land, they are quite, intimidating.
It was a bit of a throwback to the earlier iterations of Ravnos Week of Nightmare decks, where they also use a bunch of tools like Raven Spies, the equivalent of Night Terrors, and they basically try to defend themselves till they're ready to land the Week of Nightmares. but it kind of feels like this new iteration of Ravnos does still have a potential to do that if you want to play it old school.
Now, the interesting twist on the toolbox is, out of the box, this deck comes with a very defensive combat package. You've got Majesties, you've got Voracious Vermins, and also, well, Pack Alpha's not so defensive. But all those permanent combat effects, like the combat ends and dodges and stuff. A number of the vamps come with those kind of options as well. I think there's a permanent dodge somewhere.
Yes, Fireburn has the permanent dodge if you discard a random card.
Exactly. But, you know, it's a clan with animalism, and animalism traditionally has been pretty violent. You've got crows and bats, and you're dealing like 6 damage in a combat, something like that, if they're not ready. So you could also pivot into that if you wanted to, and maybe toss in a Fame, Deep Songs if you wanted. You could certainly pivot the deck in a more violent direction.
It makes it more like a wall deck with a Wake of Nightmare Owls to make. Plus, you still get Obfuscate, so you can. I wouldn't recommend it because this is a issue with Nosferatu as well, where Animalism doesn't really go well. Obfuscate, but you do still get access to like Soul at Night, and that's relevant in a Crow and Bats, so the combat package. And I think the third option that I see is there is a potential for a going wide strategy with a breed option. So the new Ravnos clan still has access to Tuminos, which is, for the viewers at home, a 2 blood cost action requires Ravnos that basically puts a 2 capacity Ravnos vampire into play, but they come into play with basic chemistry, and they only get a free discipline card if you already have it in your hand. So if you choose to ignore or lean to Cloak the Gathering and Build the Legions stealth options, the fact that they only get chemistry and can't search your library for discipline card, I think it's fine. They also get the sect of whichever their sire is. So because your entire crypt here are Anarchs, you're basically getting little Anarchs with access to some of the 3-way Anarch cards that have chemistry, and there are some 3-way Anarch cards that have decent crossover between chemistry and presence and obfuscate that you can run in the deck that makes it make sense. And the wider you go, the more effective Wake of Nightmares will be.
I never considered that, you know, Tumninos might actually go well with this new crypt. I kind of figured, oh, there's no chemistry, why are you even playing Tumninos with this crypt? Just play one of the older crypts instead. And it's not like any of the new cards can be played by Tumninos either. So, yeah, I think you have a valid point with the cloak and veil options to, you know, cloak your little vamps. It's an interesting twist to the old Ravnos clown car.
And they still have access to, I mean, we're going to talk about this in literally just a little bit, but they still get access to cards like Patchave and Ravnos Carnival, which means the blood costs for Tuminos isn't as bad as it looks on paper. Plus, I think you mentioned during the podcast or slightly before that the new set of cards that are available to Ravnos and vampires with Ravnos disciplines are not as blood intensive as they used to be. You could get away with an entire deck that has no, 0 cards with blood costs and have it be a halfway decent deck.
Right, so how would you tweak this particular deck?
So the most obvious thing that came to my mind is have them hang out with some ministry vamps. Ultimately, they will suffer the same issues as the new Banu Hakim, new ministry. Okay, the new ministry is a different story altogether, but they do have that whole we don't really hang well with the older clan problem. And because this is the first set that we're getting, Ravnos with this discipline spread, you're a bit restricted in terms of crypt that you can use. Looking at the crypt, it's either how do I make the library work for specifically this crypt, or you're really looking at who out there has crossovers with this new crypt that, something like, can I get away with not playing Presence and go hang out with Nosferatu? What toys do I get there? Can I get away with not playing that many animalism stuff and go hang out with Ministry? And I think that's really the only sort of crypt options for upgrade that you get.
Well, for me personally, I prefer to look at the vamps that I actually care about and just double up. So I often go with like a 2/2 kind of crypt.
There's also nothing stopping you from chucking a bunch of Anarch converts in there.
Sure.
Unfortunately, they don't get the benefit of Week of Nightmares, but they're still a cheeky bleed for one.
Not only a cheeky bleed for one, they also get an early edge. But yeah.
Library cards then, other than the Ravnos Carnival and the patch shift that I mentioned earlier, what would you do to the deck?
So I was looking at the overall deck, and I noticed that there's only 4 cards which actually cost blood. We've got Night Terrors, which is good, Visions of Zapathura, and Majesty. Visions of Zapathura, you could consider, opting for Party Out of Bounds instead, which is out of the Ministry deck. It doesn't have a blood cost, only reduces bleeds by 2, and also has the vote option.
Yes, plus 2 votes.
You don't get the Protean option, but already it's a cheaper option that doesn't spend blood. And Majesty, unless you've got plans for your other action or blocks, you could downgrade that to Stare Down or just run more Voracious Vermin like I mentioned earlier. I'd happily run like 6 or 8 Voracious Vermin. At that point, the only card you're spending blood on is Night Terrors, and you could put in cards like Villain to pull back your blood because you're not spending it on much else. And the deck also doesn't make any use of the Trifle action, so yeah, it's basically a free Master card action.
You can definitely also consider Life in the City. Sometimes it's just that one extra blood that might be able to get you across the line, especially with Week of Nightmares out and you can't hunt.
Yeah, fair enough. I don't know what it is about Life in the City. I never used to play it, but in recent months, it's kind of grown on me.
It's good. It's Life in the City. I swear one day you will come into a podcast and say, I don't know what it is about Ascendance.
I was looking at Ascendance.
Best card in the game. Yeah, I think all in all, the deck is a very well put together deck in terms of providing options because, it's not like it's hyper focused on a single strategy, especially if you consider something like 5th edition was meant to introduce newer players to the game. It's doing a great job of just opening it up. It's not like, if you're a combat deck, that's what you do. You punch stuff. If you're a stealth bleed deck, that's what you do. You bleed at stealth, so on and so forth. And I introduced the whole idea that you can do a whole bunch of other stuff relatively easily.
I like it.
It kind of sounds like, yeah, I did have a bunch of things to say, but you said everything. So.
I guess it's kind of always the case with toolboxy kind of decks. You look at it and you wonder, does this actually do anything? And it's easy to look at it and say it doesn't really do anything very well, and I don't think it was meant to. It's meant to do all sorts of things just well enough.
Yeah, I guess with that, we've come to the end of the deck review for the Ravnos deck. Thank you, John, for coming on and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you for having me.
We hope you at home have found this useful and helpful. And if you think we've missed anything or there's anything else to see, let us know in the comments. And until next time, see ya.
Bye bye.